Welcome everyone after the lunch break. My name is Celina Novak, and I'm a professor of criminal law at the Institute of Law Studies of the Polish Academy of Sciences. And I was asked by the organizers, Serena, to chair this afternoon session. It's going to be quite a challenge after a very nice Italian buffet lunch. I hope we can cope with the amount of calories. I mean, myself at least. But yes, I was asked by the organizers, and again by organizers I mean Serena, to remind everyone to sign the forms for recording, that you consent to recording the conference. This panel is going, as far as I understand, the idea behind it, as it was put by the organizers. This panel is meant to be more into the details of the convention and of the implementation of the convention. And as a criminal lawyer, I am particularly interested in knowing how the implementation of the convention goes in the member states, and I'm really looking forward to the presentations that we will have in a moment. We will start with Vincenzo Militello, who's a professor of also criminal law in University of Palermo. Vincenzo, you have the floor and the microphone.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you also to Serena Forlati for this very interesting workshop to discuss at near 20 years the Palermo Convention. I take reference to the last word of Alessandro Annoni that say how important is the definition of organized criminal group. And in the wide framework of the convention, my short presentation will give the attention to the figure of the participation in a criminal organization. One step back. The criminal legislation of the different countries concerning the most serious forms of organized crime was particularly fragmented at the end of the 19th. The long preparatory work to formulate a common definition of the participation in a criminal organization has produced a solution that distinguishes two aspects of the problems. In the first, the terms of the notion of criminal organization are fixed. In the second, the conduct to be incriminated by the states is specified. With regard to the first aspect, Article 2 laid down a wide definition of criminal organization. This definition brings together naturalistic and normative elements, both of which, in their turn, requiring further definition. The naturalistic element include, first, the participation of at least 3 persons, and second, activities concerted among the subjects comprising the group that lasts over a certain period of time. The normative elements include the reference to the structured group and the notion of serious crime. On these topics, I will shortly present a critical point of view. As regards to the notion of serious crime, considered as the goals matter of the operation of group, a fixed parameter has been adopted. All offenses punishable by a maximum deprivation of liberty of at least 4 years or a more serious penalty. In so doing, however, the law ends up by embracing groups of subjects involved in highly differentiated criminal activities that vary according to the countries in which they operate. Thus, a fixed level of sanctions as reference for serious crime disregards the considerable difference that exists nowadays also among the criminal law system of the more than 190 UN member states in the matter of establishing sanctions for crimes. As concern of the other element, the definition of the structured group, the formula adopted only requires that the group should not be randomly formed for the immediate commission of an offense. Consequently, it may be held that the notion of the structured group should be limited to situations in which the group presents some kind of stability in the components and in their respective criminal roles. But this is expressly excluded. The norm states the group does not need to have formally defined roles for its members, continuity of its membership, or a developed structure. In fact, a rigid organizational model is only one of the possible forms adopted by criminality nowadays, which can also take the form of a temporary alliance among different groups in the pursuit of criminal interests, like traffic of migrants. Although the formula adopted in the convention has quite rightly not neglected these forms of criminality, it has ended up by proposing a solution that is so wide as to eclipse the necessary distinction between the simple complicity of 2 persons in a single crime and the specific danger represented by an organization whose program covers an indeterminate number of crimes. As concerned former, reference also the necessary distinction between the complicity and the danger of an organization, reference can be made to the notion of the group as randomly formed for the immediate commission of an offense, which has been excluded from the definition of a structured group in the text of the norm. However, in order to produce a better definition of this difficult concept, it would be, in my opinion, advisable to view the organizational condition as a division of labor, criminal labor, among at least 3 persons. Such operational structure are the form of the rationalization of criminal work that increase the range of the activities performed by the group and can thus justify the punishment of the specific crime of participation in an organized group. In this respect, the Convention decision to opt for a less precise choice is due to the influence exercised by common law penal system. Here, the category of conspiracy covers not only the form of simple consent to commit crimes, but also the actual performance of 1 or more crimes by an organized group. This ambiguity is perfectly represented by the double definition of conduct to be criminalized as participation in an organized criminal group. In respect of this second point, the notion of criminal participation, The first form of conduct is related to the agreement with only one other person who commits a serious crimes for the purpose relating directly or indirectly to obtaining a financial or other material benefit, which include an agreement between, this definition is clearly linked to the Anglo-Saxon category of conspiracy, which includes an agreement between two or more persons aimed at the perpetration of an unlawful act for or the performance of a lawful fact by unlawful means. In this manner, however, the Convention does not correctly focus upon the specific danger of a criminal organization, understood as a quid pluris with respect to the mere participation in a single crime. Nor is it sufficient to overcome this obstacle by including the reference that a financial or other material benefit must be necessary purpose of the agreed action, because the intent to acquire unlawful material advantage is present in a very large number of crimes. Nevertheless, the conduct of the participation in a criminal organization is described in the UN Convention, expressing as it does, the subjective and objective characteristics that justify the autonomous incrimination of such a criminal organization. For the subjective elements, it is requested that the subject be aware of the unlawful activities of the criminal group, or at least those concerning unlawful aims. In objective terms, it is necessary that the subject participates either directly in the group's criminal activity or only in such other activities that are, however, designed to achieve the unlawful aims of the criminal groups. But the formulation of the provision is not actually free from technical imperfection. For example, participatory conduct in not directly unlawful activities replicates what was originally stated as regards the subjective elements, that is, the subject's necessary knowledge of the criminal purposes of the organization. In fact, we should not be surprised of the technical difficulties encountered in formulating this norm. The definition of a model of incrimination that could be potentially valid for every penal system is not an easy task. Thus, delicate problems are raised concerning what standards should be taken between the various solutions available in this sector. I take reference to the three principal models in this field, ranked according to an increasing higher level of formalization, of legal formalization of the requisites characterizing the phenomenon. They can be labeled as no crime solution, generic crime solution, and specific crime solution. The first, it denies the necessity to criminalize in an independent and separate way collective criminal organization. In this model, the criminal relevance of the conduct of the various individuals involved depends upon the commission of a different crime or at least an attempt to commit such a crime, with the possibility then of applying the general rules governing participation in a crime. The second model, the generic crime solution, the independent and separate criminal relevance of an association owing to the unlawful nature of its aim or the means employed to achieve its aims, is the most widespread solution currently adopted by many criminal law systems. Even apart from the legal tradition such systems belong to. In the majority of the case, the association is punished for pursuing a plan prohibited by law in a general terms. The model is the Association de malfaiteurs in the French criminal code. No particular elements are required in relation to the method of implementing the plan or the collective structure that must support the unlawful implementation. Only in some cases is criminal relevance also attributed to the unlawful methods employed for illegal purpose, but the methods characterizing the action of organized crime are never specified. The last model is the specific crime solution, the new model. The express consideration of organized crime as a specific type of criminal enterprise represents the most recent solution adopted in this field, but so far only by a limited number of states. The relative provisions are regarded as being special rules with respect to unlawful association in general. In this very short general framework, the provisions contained in the Palermo Convention for the incrimination of participation in a criminal organization reveals itself to be the outcome of a kind of hybridation of the three above outlined models. The definition of an organized criminal group is influenced by the experience of penal systems that have recently introduced specific offenses against organized crime. But the two types of participatory conduct juxtapose the simple unlawful agreement model, even if only between two persons, alongside the model that, as with the association des malfaiteurs, necessitate a more ample grouping, at least 3 persons. And in its turn, criminal also those activities which, although lawful, are carried out in the knowledge that they contribute towards the fulfillment of the criminal aim of the group. This has been made possible by considering responsibility not as internal participation in the group, but as a kind of complicity by a subject who is formally external to it. This external situation has a bearing upon the experience of the case law in Italian penal system. The choice of creating a hybrid model is an attempt to maximize the supranational coverage of activities related to organized crime. We agree with this objective of harmonization, but in my opinion, this hybrid model cannot be more important of the fundamental need to make the punishment adequate, proportionate to the crime. The forms of conducts that are treated as equal as regard the obligation of incrimination must reacquire their difference when the supranational obligation is implemented by the national states. It will be especially important to ascertain that the single penal system ensured a different sanction as between illicit agreements involving only 2 persons and agreements formed in the context of structured groups. In order to repress organized crime, the proportion of the penal sanction to the substantial gravity of the fact as determined by national codes is no less important in producing a common platform for fighting such crime at international level, world level. However, in reestablishing the diversity in the punishment imposed for the multiple activities of organized crime, this will not constitute an impediment to the international cooperation in the subject matter by virtue of the homogeneous framework outlined in the comprehensive text of the Palermo Convention. Short, the sense of the Palermo Convention, in my opinion, should not be sought in having introduced this or that single and more or less innovative and effective measure to combat crime. Instead, it largely seems to consist in having developed a common language in the fight against transnational organized crime. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vincenzo. With this presentation, as you heard, we covered the substantive issue, the substantive criminal law issue, referring to the definition of organized crime. And I'm really glad that this intervention pointed out to the most challenging efforts that our national legislators face when it comes to implementation of the convention. And in criminal law, because of the nullum crimen sine lege principle, we have to be really precise, and the principle of certainty of criminal law requires that on the national level we adopt specific features of crimes, even though the international legislator might have a bit of a different approach. And now with the presentation of Antonio Balsamo, a professor of criminal law and currently an advisor to the permanent representative of Italy to the United Nations, we will touch upon more procedural issues, but still in the field of criminal law. Please.
Thank you. It is a great honor for me to speak after Vincenzo Militello, who is at the origin of my interest in international criminal law due to the initiatives that he undertook in the framework of the Falcone program of the European Union just 20 years ago. First of all, I would like to underline that the obligations relating to judicial cooperation mirror the high-value potential of the Palermo Convention in 4 respects. First, the actual universality of the UNTOC Convention. Second, the ever-increasing extent of the scope of the application of the Convention, which covers a vast number of criminal phenomena, for instance, cybercrime, economic crime, and terrorism-related offenses. With reference to these criminal phenomena, I would like to say something in support of the ideas that have been illustrated this morning by Professor Julia Lix. I would like to mention the thought of Giovanni Falcone, expressed in a conference held at the Rosselli Circle in Florence in 1989, when he said, "I disagree about the difference between the mafia and the terrorism, in the sense that terrorism would have its own ideology and its political aims, while the mafia would be devoid of ideology and only aimed at profit. In my judicial activity," said Giovanni Falcone, "I found the opposite." Third, the comprehensiveness and the interconnection of commitments imposed on states. Fourth, the legislative drafting technique based on general clauses. This is the issue that has already been addressed by Professor Forlati about the flexibility of the ANTOC. We can see ANTOC also as the legal source of a new human rights-based approach to judicial cooperation obligations. We make a reference to the ideas very well expressed by Professor Forlati. We think that there is a traditional approach that considers the judicial cooperation obligations as intergovernmental obligations aimed at tackling the transnational dimension of crime, just as a network of obligations that mutually connect states with each other in a securitarian perspective. But there is a new approach under construction which may consider this as procedural positive obligations stemming from the provisions of the European Convention on Human Rights, like Article 4, interpreted in the light of ANTOC and its protocol on trafficking in persons. Such obligations aimed at protecting fundamental rights of victims are to be fulfilled by all state authorities, executive, legislative and judicial, and everyone has the right to an effective remedy for acts that violate his fundamental rights. The turning point is the judgment of the Strasbourg Court in Rantsev versus Cyprus and Russia. This judgment has adopted a systemic interpretation of the provisions of the Rome Convention in the light of the Trafficking in Persons Protocol supplementing the Palermo Convention. Clearly, a key feature of the Palermo Convention is the enhancement of international cooperation, both at an informal level, mainly between law enforcement authorities, witness protection authorities, and financial intelligence, but clearly at a formal level, mainly between judicial authorities, with a specific reference to mutual legal assistance, extradition, seizure, and confiscation of proceeds of crime. A brief premise, the development of international judicial cooperation is not only a technical issue, it is also a matter of mutual trust, of fruitful meeting and comparison between legal cultures with a view to harmonization of legislations where appropriate and necessary, and a matter of common commitment based on shared values. And this is a significant lesson that can be drawn from the original aim and the subsequent implementation of the Palermo Convention. Here you can see the signing conference of the Palermo Convention and a building which is located in Palermo but could be elsewhere. We will see other pictures about similar buildings. There was a very meaningful speech delivered at the opening of the signing conference for the ANTOC in Palermo by the Secretary General of the United Nations, who clearly connected the globalization with the risks and the opportunities against and in favor of the protection of fundamental rights. The main provisions of ANTOC on international judicial cooperation are clearly Article 16, which contains a regulation of extradition based on the principle aut dedere aut judicare, but I would like to underscore that for this purpose, the transnationality of the offense is not required. Another important feature is given by Article 18, which has been considered as a comprehensive mutual legal assistance treaty, open to any new forms and tools. also for this purpose, the requirement of transnationality applies to investigations rather than to the crime itself. It is a clear feature of this provision that extends the scope of international judicial cooperation in a very meaningful way. We will see some recent expressions of this trend. There is obviously a regulatory framework about the transfer of persons and of criminal proceedings. There are other provisions on specific forms of international cooperation. I would like to mention three of them. Article 13, about international cooperation for purposes of confiscation. Article 19, about the joint investigations, including the establishment of joint investigative bodies. In my opinion, this could be a new frontier of international judicial cooperation. Article 20, about bilateral or multilateral agreements or arrangements for using special investigative techniques, not only controlled delivery, but also electronic surveillance and undercover operations. In the absence of agreements and arrangements, it is possible to make decisions on a case-by-case basis. Now we have to deal with the added value of the Palermo Convention for international judicial cooperation, starting from two significant cases from Sicily. Here you see two other buildings located in Palermo, but they could be as well in China or in Morocco. First case. It is possible to enhance cooperation on execution of non-conviction-based confiscation in other states outside the European Union. There is a recent leading case. In 2018, the Tribunal of Catania ordered the seizure and confiscation of assets of very high value belonging to an important entrepreneur who was considered as an external participant in a mafia-type association. This judicial decision applied patrimonial prevention measures, which can be included in the category of non-conviction-based confiscation. The prototype of this kind of confiscation is the civil forfeiture, which is widespread in common law countries. Among the assets for which the Court of Catania ordered the seizure and confiscation, there were some bank accounts located in countries outside the European Union. The request for the execution of the order to seize the bank accounts abroad was based on Article 18 of the Palermo Convention, and it was successful. There is also a recent experience, which is a very innovative way of implementing mutual legal assistance. It is the first bilateral deployment to the Palermo and Catania prosecution offices for a period of 12 months of a Nigerian senior federal prosecutor from the Nigerian Ministry of Justice, facilitated and supported by UNODC. Meaningfully, the prosecutor was deployed on the basis of Article 18 of the Palermo Convention. She was embedded in the prosecution offices of Palermo and Catania, where many cases of smuggling of migrants by sea are prosecuted. The relevance of the activity which was performed by the Nigerian prosecutor was not only from a technical viewpoint. She certainly helped the exchange of information. She was able to see how prosecutors in Italy tackle criminal networks based abroad. She also sent some materials which were very helpful in order to aid the Nigerian law or enforcement authorities in the prosecution of the counterparts of Italian trafficking gangs. But more generally, she was able to deliver a very meaningful knowledge of the social roots of a criminal phenomenon. This was a cultural enrichment for the Italian judiciary. This experience has been replicated in other countries, such as Spain and France. In my opinion, at the moment, we have a two-way relationship between UNTOC and EU legislation, because the cases we have just dealt with show how an innovative implementation of the UNTOC can put into practice the same new forms of judicial cooperation that have been already created by EU legislation through the recent regulation of the mutual recognition of freezing orders and confiscation orders, which applies both to conviction and non-conviction-based confiscation according to the Italian prominent scholars, and such as the joint action of 1996 concerning a framework for the exchange of liaison magistrates. This is the category where the deployment of the Nigerian prosecutor can be included. But, however, by means of UNTOC, it is also possible to reach new goals that have not yet been achieved by European legislation, because EU legislation lacks regulation on 2 points. First, real-time interception and online search. Second, the transnational legal status to be accorded to collaborators of justice and protected witnesses. There was a resolution of the so-called Commission Against Mafia of the European Parliament in 2011. It was not followed by a relevant legislation. However, these 2 points have been addressed by the Palermo Convention. There is a new frontier of international judicial cooperation, the cyber investigation, because the recent legislation and case law of Italy are moving towards an integrated system of fight against organized crime, terrorism, and corruption by means of the resort to remote interceptions and searches of a computerized device under a strong judicial supervision. This investigative tool is a form of electronic surveillance carried out through the installation of Trojan horses on smartphones, tablets, laptops, and so on. Obviously, it requires a progress in terms of definition and protection of fundamental rights. It requires common standards of protection of human rights. And given the technical nature and the transnationality, which are typical of the cyber investigation, it is important to provide mutual legal assistance at the international level with a view to creating a common legal framework. The use of such special investigative techniques in the context of international cooperation is fostered just by Article 20 of the UNTOC that we have already examined. I would like to raise a question. Probably there is a fight between the future and the past. The future could be the Trojan horses, the past could be the collaborators of justice, but I'm not so sure. Probably there is a timeless lesson that may be applied also with regard to the mafias on the move. There is a beautiful sentence by Giovanni Falcone who said, "The interpretation of signs, gestures, messages, and silences is one of the main activities of the man of honor." and consequently of the magistrate. I think that collaborators of justice may play a crucial role in order to allow us to interpret the words, the messages, and everything that may be taken from other investigative tools, such as real-time interceptions. Without the cultural contribution made by collaborators of justice, it would be impossible to understand the real meanings of data coming from interceptions and other investigative instruments. You can see here the first moment in which Tommaso Buscetta spoke with Judge Giovanni Falcone. It was on the 16th of July of 1984. And also for this reason, it is important to develop the international relocation of protected witnesses. It is an opportunity that has not been addressed by the EU legislation, but may be addressed on the basis of Article 24 of the Palermo Convention. On the slide, you can see the meaning of this opportunity. Yes, I am going to conclude, don't worry. I think that the Palermo Convention is really a great legacy of Giovanni Falcone. And as Giovanni Falcone said, people come and go, but their ideas remain and continue, walking on the legs of other people. This is the establishment of the review mechanism. I would like to show you the atmosphere of real enthusiasm that accompanied this moment. Some of the persons that are with me here were also present in that moment, like Professor Fernando della Chiesa. And I think that the review mechanism may really be a great tool for strengthening cooperation for a lot of reasons, including the dialogue to be opened with civil society. This is a great added value of the review mechanism that cannot be underestimated, because in my opinion, community-based responses are as important as institutional responses against organized crime. I would like to conclude with some words of a great emperor and philosopher who is part of the history of Vienna, and in my opinion expressed very well the Vienna spirit. He was Marcus Aurelius, who wrote just near Vienna his meditations, and he expresses the depths that he hold to have with respect to some persons, including his brother Severus. He said, I received from him the idea of a society with equal laws, equal rights, and equal freedom of speech, of a government which respects the liberty of the governed above all else. I would like to express my appreciation, my gratitude to Professor Celina Forlati, Fernando della Chiesa, and Christian Ponti for these initiatives, which really increase the awareness, the knowledge of the Palermo Convention in full compliance with the Vienna spirit and the ideas of this great philosopher of the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Antonio. And again, I'm sorry about, being so strict on time, but we've got other speakers. I noted one word from the beginning of your speech, which is commitment, and I think that it is very good news that you find that the Palermo Convention provides national authorities with effective measures to address this constantly evolving forms of crime, but I think that it does require commitment, and in this point I'm very much in agreement with you. We will now move on to the victims' rights as covered by the Palermo Convention, and I would like to give the floor to Ruth Shrimpling, representing an umbrella organization of organizations advocating for victim rights. Please, Ruth.
Thank you, Celina, and thank you, Vincenzo and Antonio, for such interesting interventions. My name is Ruth Shrimpling. I'm here today on behalf of Victim Support Europe. I would like to extend my sincere thanks to Serena, Ilario, and your team for inviting Victim Support Europe to speak today amongst such prominent experts and academics in this field, because by doing so, you have invited into the discussion the voice of victims in Europe. These voices often go unheard, especially those of the most vulnerable groups, such as victims of trafficking, who are the unfortunate human consequences of transnational organized crime. So this presentation will look at the obligations of prevention, protection, and assistance of victims of crime, looking specifically at how these obligations, bound by international and European instruments, fail to function effectively in practice. I will start by providing a short introduction to Victim Support Europe and the work that we do. I will then explain victims' needs and why this is such an important starting point when considering any approach in the sphere of criminology. I will then use the findings of recent research work and advocacy work to demonstrate how the rights established in theory are applied or fail to be applied in reality. And by doing so, I'll also explore the EU Directive of Victims' Rights, and we'll conclude by looking at recommendations for future action. So Victim Support Europe is an umbrella organization of 56 member organizations made up of NGOs, state actors, individuals, and universities. We represent the voices of victim support services in every EU member state and beyond. So we cover 31 countries, all EU member states, but we also have member organizations, Victim Support New Zealand, Canada, Israel, and we recently inaugurated a new member of Victim Support Asia, which is Victim Support South Korea. Altogether, we represent the voices of victims and victim support organizations, and we do this by promoting the rights and services of all victims of crime across Europe and beyond. We achieve this through advocating to improve EU and international laws, through research and knowledge development, and through capacity building and at a national and regional level. So as an example of recent work, the upcoming publication of the European Vociare project investigated whether the rights established in the EU Victims Directive are implemented on the field. So we achieved this by analyzing legislation and policy in 26 EU member states. We surveyed almost 800 victim support professionals in Europe, so members of the judiciary, investigators, prosecutors, police, social workers. We interviewed hundreds of victims, and the results enabled us to identify key gaps, causes, and development of EU recommendations. We are currently working on another European project called Victoria, in which we're providing best practices in the field of the provision of information to victims of crime, referral of victims from the police to victim services, and their needs assessment. And the beneficiaries of this project are victim services here in Italy, in Portugal, Romania, and Lithuania. And as a final example, you may be aware of it, but in March of this year, Jean-Claude Juncker's special advisor on victims of crime published her report on the functioning of compensation to victims, of which Victim Support Europe were a main contributor. conducting research and drafting key parts of the final report. So our work reflects our belief that the obligations established in international and European instruments, as seen in the Palermo Convention, must be built upon and implemented in practice. It's not enough if they exist uniquely in a paper form. We have to ensure that support for victims of crime is integrated into judicial and police services and not just in social services. Support mechanisms ensure that victims report crime, that victims take an active part in criminal proceedings, that they stay in the proceedings, and that they understand and use their rights. Integrating support mechanisms into the justice system also ensures that victims are not traumatized or re-victimized by legal proceedings and are treated with respect and dignity throughout. Quite simply, if you don't have support mechanisms in place, you don't have an effective justice system. So to evaluate if any given justice process is effectively meeting its obligations towards victims, obligations which are set out in the Palermo Convention, in the EU Directive on Victims' Rights, a starting point is always to evaluate if the process meets the victim's needs. So all victims of crime have 5 general needs. So respect and recognition, support and information, access to justice, which is particularly relevant for victims of trafficking, as they often struggle to access justice. They often struggle to even report the crime to the police. Protection, which is once again particularly pertinent to victims of trafficking, who will have a heightened need of protection in most cases, and the need for compensation and restoration. So this pyramid on your left illustrates the different layers of needs. So the foundation is always the 5 general needs, which we just discussed. Above that, we must consider the needs of specific groups. So if we take, for example, trafficked victims as a specific group, as I mentioned, they have the specific needs of a heightened need of protection. They need safeguards and firewalls to ensure that they can report the crime and have access to justice. And then we have individual needs. So individual needs touch on anything that's to do with the personal situation and character of the victim. So this can be emotional, psychological needs or financial needs. So the Palermo Convention contains numerous provisions for victims of transnational organized crime. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I'm sure you all know this a lot better than I do, but as you can see, there's the need for compensation. They talk about assistance and protection of victims. There's provisions for prevention, detection, and control. And likewise, the pursuing protocols also contain provisions which look to protect the obligations towards victims of crime. At a European level, these provisions have been built upon in the 2012 EU Directive, Victims' Rights Directive. So in the present graphic, which comes from a publication by the European Commission, we see that a victim's right to understand and be understood is essential, as is the right to information, to support, to participate in criminal proceedings, and to protection and individual assessment. There's also an overriding right, which is enshrined in the EU directive, and that is for all victims of crime to be treated with respect and dignity. As you can see in the top circle, the Victims' Rights Directive also seeks to protect the rights of victims' family members, which is especially pertinent in cases of trafficking and organized mafia crime, where whole families may be indebted and threatened by a transnational criminal organization. So I'm sure you're all well aware of these obligations established through these various instruments, but are member states using these provisions, are they implemented in practice, and are victims of crimes benefiting from these protections? Well, we know that a large number of these rights are not fully implemented. We know that victims face re-victimization and re-traumatization at the hands of police officers and throughout criminal proceedings. We know that basic provisions are not put in place across all member states. Very simple provisions, such as the possibility to testify through video link or to have a separate waiting room from the offender in the courthouses. These are two practical provisions which prevent unnecessary contact between the victim and the offender, but these are practical provisions which are implemented in a small number of European countries. We know that victims who do not speak the national language of the country where they are victimized are not always provided with a translator, which is hugely problematic for victims of trafficking. And these victims must then bear the cost themselves of translating official documents, or the case will be dropped. We know that police are not sufficiently trained on victim-sensitive behavior and effective referral systems to victim services once the crime has been reported. We know that victims do not receive information, and when they do, they don't understand the information that they have received because it's too legally technical. We know that certain groups of victims are less likely to report to the police: undocumented migrants, victims from the Roma community, ethnic minorities, victims of domestic abuse. But still, there's not sufficient safeguards to ensure that these groups can report in a safe way. So here in this slide, we have just 4 of such observations. So the United Nations Economic and Social Affairs in 2015 reported that less than 40% of women who experience violence will seek help. And within that 40%, less than 10% of those will report that violence to the police. A recent research project which was conducted by Victim of Support Europe surveyed over 200 victims from across Europe, and more than 70% of those 200 victims surveyed claimed that they were re-victimized during legal proceedings, and that re-victimization actually forced them to stop continuing with legal proceedings. And then 52% of those victims claimed that they did not receive sufficient information, or the information that they received they did not understand. If victims don't come forward and seek help, and they don't report the crime remains unknown, it remains hidden, and its perpetrators continue to exploit the victim and to find new victims. If a victim faces re-victimization from legal proceedings or from contact with the police, they are more likely to withdraw a complaint or decide to not continue with proceedings, to the same effect as if they had never reported the crime at all. If victims are not informed or generally misinformed about their rights and available support services, they might not even realize that they're victims, and they won't seek the help that they need. This will stop them coming forward and stop them seeking the help, but it will also stop the police seeking the criminal behind the crime. When victims' rights are not implemented in practice, the justice system not only fails to protect these victims, it fails to protect itself from ongoing criminalization, which could otherwise be prevented. It also fails to deliver the obligations it is bound to adhere to through the Palermo Convention and through the EU Directive on Victims' Rights. So how do we ensure that these obligations are guaranteed in practice? Well, we can start by implementing victim-oriented justice systems, because justice must not further harm victims. This should always be coupled with a victim-sensitive approach, which takes into consideration victims' needs and provides for respectful and dignified treatment towards victims of crime. Education for justice means educating about victims' rights at all levels. We can start this at primary schools, secondary school. We can teach the effects of victimization and teach a victim-sensitive approach as part of medical degree and law degrees. Future professional learning courses for all professionals who come into contact with victims should also be made obligatory. So here we're talking about teachers, police officers, embassy and consular staff, social workers, healthcare professionals. And this training should include recognizing the signs of trafficking, for example, but also recognizing and responding to the signs of trauma and PTSD, which are common consequences of criminal victimization. Improving accessible understanding information can be achieved through providing multi-formatted information on victims' rights and victim services. So not only the police offering the victim a written leaflet with overly legal technical language, but also having a link to a website that has a video, or having an information provisions which take into consideration victims that have special learning needs. Awareness raising is a great way of informing the wider general public about victims' rights. In 2017, Victim Support Northern Ireland placed posters about their services and information about victims' rights on public buses and in toilets of public bars and restaurants. And after that campaign, they saw an over 2,000% increase of calls to their helpline. Likewise, our member in Israel has a bus which is completely plastered in a message which says, "You must treat trauma, otherwise it reoccurs, don't live with it alone." And it includes the number of their helplines. So these are simply two very practical ways that we can increase awareness raising of victims' rights within the general public. We must also ensure effective referral mechanisms from the police to victim services that ensures that victims receive report. And we've already talked about the importance of training all professionals who come into contact with victims. This is especially important for professionals who come into contact with victims of trafficking, because they're going to have this heightened degree of vulnerability that's going to make them less likely to disclose their experience due to fear of reprisals from the trafficker, but also reprisals on their families, who are often indebted to the traffickers. Speaking of such, sorry, my final closing point, it's very important when talking about protecting victims of trafficking that throughout Europe we have safeguards for reporting and firewalls for accessing justice. If I take Belgium as an example, in Belgium, victims of trafficking, before they are granted with that status, are first undocumented migrants. Now, if that person presents themselves at a police station to claim that they are victims of trafficking, they will be arrested, they will be put in a detention centre with the view of being deported, because they practice this hierarchy of law where being undocumented is more illegal than the illegal crime that was committed to them as being trafficked. Now, this isn't legal, this practice in Belgium, but it is practiced widely across the country, and it's practiced in other European states. So think about the girl from Ghana who was trafficked into forced prostitution in Rome or London or Bucharest or Ferrara. She won't have a valid residency permit in the European country. She'll be under the control of the pimp, but also under the control of the criminal organization who trafficked her here. So she needs safeguards for reporting. She needs a firewall that ensures that when she or if she makes it to the police to report, she's not going to be arrested because she doesn't have the right visa in her passport, or because she doesn't have a passport at all. If we don't have these firewalls, we're failing these victims of trafficking. We are failing to provide them with the protective measures and support mechanisms which are provided for in our laws. So on that very cheery note, I'd like to thank you all for your attention. If you have any questions, feel free to ask now or send an email. And I invite you all to keep up to date on victims' rights through our website and our social media. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruth, for this comprehensive presentation of victims' rights and this call to implement all those safeguards for victims in practice that that I understand you formulate. I would like now ask Professor Fernando della Chiesa to take the floor and present the difference, as far as I understand, between the legislation and the practice, which is always tricky when it comes to national.
Good afternoon to all you. I'm very glad to be here today. So I want to thank the Professor Serena Forlati for inviting me, because this is a new significant step of our long scientific collaboration between the Observatory on Organized Crime of the University of Milan and Macrocrimes of the University of Ferrara. The title of my contribution is Law in the Books and Law in Action. How wide is the gap? And this is a big question and a classic problem, but a particular problem in our perspective of Palermo Convention. I will explore it through three main steps. So I'll show you 3 slides to illustrate my point of view. The gap. I told you that this is a classic problem because this is a general problem of the democracies, of the political systems, and particularly of the political regimes. It's difficult to discuss it because there are many kinds of gaps. I think that generally we can say that here there is the constitution, here there is the code, but here there is the reality, the daily society. The gaps are more or less wide, but we always find this existence. There is a distance always from the code, from the constitution. And what does this phenomenon happen? Why, sorry, does this phenomenon happen? For many factors in variable combinations that I tried to synthesize like this. We have, firstly, the spirit of the times, zeitgeist. That means what the people think, really. Which values are more important for the nations? What definition we give of fair and unfair? The spirit of the times is a a very important condition to understand this gap. And it's impossible to eliminate this gap because the spirit of the times continuously is changing the notion of fair or unfair, reformulate the values of the nations. We can see it now continuously in Europe, not only in Europe. This spirit is important for the application and for the interpretation of the laws. We can see it about the big questions of migrants at this moment. The social power relations are important to generate the gap. Relations, the sociology of law is produced many books about this problem, about the relationships between the application and interpretation of law and the power groups in this specific era in these or in other nations. Cultural deviations of magistrates, they exist. You know that they exist, particularly in the face of organized crime, because they are cultural attitudes. They are cultural attitudes to interpret not only the laws, but the reality too. And the perfect law many times doesn't exist. So the responsibility in facing organized crime many times is of the magistrate. And corruption. Corruption is the phenomenon very influent on the application of the law, of correct interpretation of the law. So the gap is produced in an important size by the corruption. But there are here general considerations. I want to speak more specifically on organized crime and on the gap when we have to face organized crime. We have cultural insufficiencies in magistrates. I'm continuing to tell the magistrates in the high school of Italian magistrates that we suffer cultural insufficiencies in interpretation of the reality. Is there or not the mafia in northern Italy? And the answer conditions all the justice and produces a new demands of justice. The love of peace and quiet is a long problem, is an old problem. The inaptitude to face the organized crime for love of peace and quiet of the state, of the representatives of the state in public administration or in justice. A political will, how is important organized crime for a political coalition, for a political government, or for the principal party of a country. How is important? We in Italy can see in these years that organized crime is out of political agenda. So it's important to understand the gap between law and action. So the intimidation is another factor that conditions the behaviors, the public behaviors in many occasions. When Mario Draghi was leading the Banca d'Italia, said in our university that it was impossible to face the laundering in some Italian regions because the employees of the banks couldn't contrast or face the criminal organizations for fear, just for fear, yes. Corruption and complicity too, again, also in this particular perspective. But in my opinion is more important to analyze this question for Palermo Convention, because we are discussing about the Palermo Convention, and because there are new problems for Palermo Convention. I agree very much with Ugi Zvekic, who this morning said that there is not the political climate of Palermo. It's a big truth, in my opinion. You said the golden age of the fight against organized crime has finished, has probably finished, temporarily finished, but I think that at present you are right. We have not that climate. The world changed in 15 or in 20 years. I mean, there are structural, natural reasons of problematic for this kind of international conventions, always. Because there are deep cultural differences among the states. I mean, Germany is unlike Italy for sensibility toward organized crime. Montenegro is unlike Libya. USA is unlike China. And I could continue. On a general level, there is, I think, the so-called burden of history in these differences. We don't live on the same wavelength. So this is normal, but I think there are some novelties, particularly two important factors more. Firstly, the world disorder. I'm thinking about Northern Africa wide Asian areas, Latin America, East Europe, Middle East. I'm thinking about foreign policies, human rights policies, ideological identities, new ideological identities. This is a different horizon. And if it's true that the world continuously is changing, it's obvious, I think that our horizon is not the same, is not similar to the horizon of 15 or 20 years ago. Is a horizon more demanding. Secondly, I'm thinking to the extension of the underground transnational laundering empire, the developing influence of the dirty money, influence bigger than before, the creation of various forms of sick capitalism, and I add that the criminal flow is longer and wider than before. The combination of these two factors, world disorder and laundering empire, generates a worrying gap, a very worrying gap. In conclusion, I say be careful. We can see good changes too. I'm thinking now about Slovakia, where was elected a new Green president. I'm thinking to new Mexican situation, where the new president declares to be face the organized crime. He wants to change the organization of the law enforcement, and not marginally. But it's increasing, in my opinion, the need to invent new operative instruments to realize the spirit and the letter of Palermo Convention for social safety. The architecture of these instruments is insufficient in front of the new situation. The change is necessary, not in the convention, but in the operative instruments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. And I would like, without further notice, to give the floor to Eugenio Zaniboni.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm so honored to be here among so many distinguished practitioners and scholars. And so I have to say, first of all, thank you to Professor Celina Forlati, and also to the whole staff that helped me to be here. So I was, generally speaking, you know, the challenge of implementation is like catching the big fish, so it's a very big issue. And because I was touched by the presentation of this morning and also of this session, I a little bit changed, you know, my very short speech. And I would like to say that some authors are describing the ANCTOC like an engine with 4 cylinders. And they say, you know, because if you want to reach the tasks of the implementation of the ANCTOC, each of those cylinders must work at their best. And of course, the cylinders are the provisions of the convention and then the 3 heading protocols, so firearms, trafficking, and smuggling. But after this interesting and real stimulating conference, I would like to see that this metaphor, it seems to be now very poor as such, because talking about the challenge of implementation, we learned how maybe 4 cylinders are insufficient at all to reach the whole target of implementation, because we should need to add at least 2 extra cylinders. And the first is maybe a closer connection with the UNCAC, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. And the other one could be the adding the closer relationship with at least with a group of convention, let me say, about the fight against drug trafficking, in order to have at least a more complete framework. But as each, in my view, the drafters created something more sophisticated of an engine with 4 or in the future maybe we hope 6, and this is a good question how to make this relationship closer, because maybe they thought to a very modern engine. It was, a hybrid engine. There is another small electric engine, workly, daily, very, very, very quiet way, in a very silent way. No toxic emission. It's an ecological engine. It's international cooperation and technical assistance. And technical assistance and international cooperation are the only way to trigger, the main engine. So we figured out this very clearly this morning and this afternoon. And so I don't want to go too much deeper into the provision of the United Nations, the UNCTOC, but it was, in my view, clear to the mind, to the drafters that if you just give a very rapid look to the Article 27, states must open channels of collaboration, not only on paper, but they have to be really effective, so Article 27. And every engine needs, of course, needs a fuel, that must be fueled in order to work. And what's the fuel? Of course, it's the problems of budgeting and financial allocations. I would be very surprised if the states would interrupt or maybe diminishing the fueling of the engine of the convention, because we know that transnational organized crime is spreading, and this is spreading, according to some statistical I could read before coming here, from the Western developed countries to the less developed countries. So, and this is a danger because, as we know, the TOC is able to take an advantage of the asymmetries in the implementation of the convention. So, not fueling too much the budget could be against the self-interest of the states, in my view. And then every engine needs of oil engine, of a lubricant, which reaches the whole parts of the engine and allows the engine to work at its best. What's the engine of the Palermo Convention? In my view, it's the mechanism of review. The oil engine must be changed time to time. It can be the same for the whole life of the engine. And so we should be happy, as Justice Balsamo said us, that for the first time it has been adopted, at least, maybe we could say a weak system of review of the convention, but it's the first time they reached a deal about it. So I hope that, time to time this oil engine will be, changed, that maybe will help it even better. Not, adopting a coercive approach, even a friendly one, but more or less like in the case of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, could be, an interesting mechanism of review. And I would like to close my very short considerations, underlining, the recent, like a revolution at least in the inner circle, in the closer circle of the European Union, according to regulation, yes, 2008-1805, about the freezing of non-conviction goods. Even with non-conviction goods, we had a regulation, at least in the European circuit, it's a very important target. So it's talking about the challenge of implementation, as already been said, it will be a very important target by the time to reach. Okay, so that's what my suggestion, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Professor Zaniboni. Since I'm the only thing that stands between you and the coffee this afternoon, do we have any questions? I think we can have like 5 minutes of questions session or coffee. Anyone, any questions? Or nothing but questions that we shall solve during the coffee break. Thank you. Well, that's the wisest choice, I suppose. Thank you very much. Thank you, the speakers, and thank you, the discutant. And let's have a coffee break. Well deserved. Thank you.